The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like ice as she pointed directly at C2A. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings immediately." Sarah Chen looked up from her book, confusion washing over her face as every passenger in first class turned to stare. She had no idea that in the next few minutes her world would completely unravel, only to be rebuilt in the most unexpected way imaginable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been dreaming of this moment for months. After working double shifts at the county hospital for 3 years straight, she had finally saved enough to upgrade to first class for her flight to Seattle. It wasn't just about the extra legroom or the fancy meals, this trip was special. Her younger sister Emma was graduating from medical school and Sarah wanted everything to be perfect. Emma had been her responsibility since their parents died in a car accident 5 years ago. Sarah had dropped out of her own nursing program to work full-time, making sure Emma could continue her studies. Every sacrifice had been worth it, watching her brilliant sister excel in her classes, knowing she was about to become the doctor she had always dreamed of being. The first-class ticket had cost Sarah nearly a month's salary, but she told herself Emma deserved to see her big sister arriving in style for once. For 3 years Sarah had lived paycheck to paycheck, wearing the same scrubs to work, driving a 15-year-old Honda with a rattling engine and eating ramen noodles more nights than she cared to admit. This one small luxury felt like a reward for all those sacrifices. She had arrived at Denver International Airport 2 hours early, her excitement barely contained. The gate agent had smiled warmly when checking her boarding pass, commenting on how lovely it must be to fly first class. Sarah had beamed with pride, clutching her ticket like a golden treasure. She had even bought a new blouse for the occasion, a soft blue cotton shirt that made her feel confident and put together. Boarding the aircraft had felt surreal. The first-class cabin was everything she had imagined, with wide leather seats that looked more like recliners than airplane chairs. Each seat had its own entertainment system, reading light, and enough space to actually stretch her legs. Sarah had settled into 2A by the window, marveling at the view of the tarmac below. The other passengers filing into first class looked exactly like she had expected. There was a woman in her 60s wearing what appeared to be a designer suit, speaking loudly into her phone about some charity gala. Behind her, a middle-aged man in an expensive watch scrolled through emails on his tablet, occasionally barking orders to someone on the other end of his Bluetooth earpiece. Sarah noticed how the flight attendants treated these passengers differently. They addressed them by name, offered them champagne before takeoff, and hung up their jackets with extra care. She wondered if they would treat her the same way, if they would assume she belonged there just like everyone else. The flight attendant working first class was a tall woman named Jessica, according to her name tag. She had perfectly styled auburn hair and moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. When she reached Sarah's row, her smile seemed to falter slightly, but Sarah convinced herself she was imagining things. "Can I get you anything to drink before takeoff?" Jessica asked, her tone polite, but somehow cooler than it had been with the other passengers. "Just water, please," Sarah replied, returning the smile. She wanted to ask about the champagne she had seen offered to others, but something held her back. As more passengers boarded, Sarah overheard conversations about business deals worth millions, vacation homes in the Hamptons, and children attending private schools she had only read about in magazines. She felt a flutter of nervousness but reminded herself that she had paid for this seat, just like everyone else. She belonged here. The woman in the designer suit, now seated across the aisle, was named Victoria Ashford, according to the flight attendant's greeting. She had silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Her handbag probably cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. Victoria had been stealing glances at Sarah since boarding, her expression growing more disapproving with each look. When Sarah pulled out her paperback novel, a romance she had bought at the airport bookstore, Victoria's eyebrows raised in obvious disdain. When Sarah declined the premium meal service because she had packed a sandwich to save money, Victoria's whispered comments to her seatmate became audible. "I don't understand how standards have fallen so much," Victoria murmured to the businessman beside her. "You used to be able to expect a certain caliber of passenger in first class." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she pretended not to hear. She focused on her book, trying to lose herself in the story, but the words blurred together as anxiety crept up her spine. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe she really didn't belong here after all. The flight had been smooth for the first hour. Sarah had actually started to relax, enjoying the comfortable seat and the view of mountains passing below. She had even managed to doze off for a few minutes, dreaming about Emma's graduation ceremony, about how proud she would be to see her sister walk across that stage. Everything changed when turbulence hit. The plane lurched suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp and grip their armrests. Sarah's water glass, which had been sitting on her tray table, slid across the surface and splashed onto the floor. It was a small amount of water, barely noticeable, but it happened to splash near Victoria's expensive leather shoes. Victoria recoiled as if she had been burned. "Excuse me," she shrieked, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "This is completely unacceptable." Sarah immediately grabbed napkins and bent down to clean up the small puddle. "I'm so sorry," she said, genuinely apologetic. "The turbulence just caught me off guard." "Turbulence?" Victoria's voice dripped with disdain. "This isn't about turbulence, this is about people who don't know how to conduct themselves in civilized society." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had been nothing but polite and quiet throughout the flight. The spill had been a complete accident, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone, but Victoria was looking at her like she had committed some unforgivable crime. "Ma'am, I really am sorry about your shoes," Sarah tried again, still on her knees cleaning the floor. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Victoria stood up abruptly, towering over Sarah with righteous indignation. "What you can do is explain to me how someone like you ended up in first class in the first place." The words hung in the air like poison. "Someone like you." Sarah felt every eye in the cabin turn toward her, felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She slowly stood up, clutching the damp napkins in her trembling hands. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah said quietly, though she understood perfectly. "Oh, I think you do," Victoria replied, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. "Your clothes, your behavior, that cheap novel you're reading. You clearly don't belong here, and frankly your presence is making the other passengers uncomfortable." Sarah glanced around the cabin and saw several other passengers nodding in agreement. The businessman Victoria had been talking to earlier was shaking his head in disgust. A woman in the back row was actually recording the confrontation with her phone. "I paid for this seat," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have every right to be here." Victoria laughed, a cold sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Paid for it? With what? Your tip money? Let me guess, you're a waitress who saved up for months just to pretend to be something you're not for a few hours." The accuracy of the assessment, even though Sarah was a hospital aide rather than a waitress, was devastating. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought about Emma, about the graduation ceremony, about all the sacrifices that had led to this moment. "My job doesn't determine my worth as a person," Sarah managed to say. "Doesn't it?" Victoria's smile was cruel. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you're playing dress-up in a world you don't understand. This isn't a bus or a subway car, sweetheart. This is first class, and some of us have standards." That's when Jessica, the flight attendant, approached. Having been summoned by Victoria's dramatic gesturing, Sarah felt a moment of hope that someone in authority would intervene, would restore some sense of fairness to the situation. Instead, Jessica's expression was apologetic, but not toward Sarah. "Oh. I'm terribly sorry about this disruption, Mrs. Ashford," Jessica said, her voice professionally concerned. "Let me see what I can do to resolve this situation." Sarah watched in growing horror as Jessica turned toward her with a forced smile. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings immediately." "What?" Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Why, I haven't done anything wrong. You've clearly made some of our premium passengers uncomfortable," Jessica explained, as if this was a reasonable justification. "We have a policy about maintaining the appropriate atmosphere in first class." "What policy?" Sarah demanded, her voice finally finding some strength. "Show me where it says that people can be removed from seats they paid for because of their clothing or their job." Jessica's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the discomfort underneath. "Ma'am, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. We have other seats available in economy where you'll be more comfortable." More comfortable? As if the issue was Sarah's comfort rather than the prejudice of the other passengers. Sarah felt anger building in her chest, hot and righteous and unfamiliar. She had spent her entire adult life being accommodating, being understanding, putting other people's needs before her own. But this was different. This was wrong. "I'm not moving," Sarah said,
her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I paid for this seat, and I have done absolutely nothing to justify being removed from it." The declaration sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. Victoria's face turned red with indignation. The businessman started muttering about calling airport security. Several other passengers began talking loudly about the disruption, about how inappropriate Sarah's behavior was. Jessica looked genuinely distressed now, caught between an unreasonable passenger complaint and a paying customer who was technically in the right. "Ma'am, please," she pleaded. "I'm trying to handle this as diplomatically as possible." "There's nothing diplomatic about discrimination," Sarah replied, surprised by her own boldness. "And that's exactly what this is." Victoria had heard enough. She pushed past Jessica and stood directly in front of Sarah, her face twisted with rage. "How dare you play the victim here? You've disrupted this entire cabin with your clumsiness and your attitude. None of us should have to tolerate this kind of behavior from someone who clearly bought their ticket with charity money or some kind of assistance program." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Charity money assistance program. The assumptions behind Victoria's accusations revealed everything about how she saw the world, how she categorized people based on their appearance and perceived social status. "You don't know anything about me," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't know what I've been through or what I've sacrificed to be here." "I know enough," Victoria shot back. "I know that you don't belong in first class, and I know that your presence here is ruining the experience for people who actually deserve to be here." Deserve, the word echoed in Sarah's mind as she looked around the cabin at faces filled with disgust and judgment. These people believed they deserved luxury simply by virtue of their wealth. They believed that money made them inherently better, more worthy of respect and comfort. Sarah thought about Emma, about the years of 16-hour shifts, about the nights she had fallen asleep at the kitchen table studying for her GED because she was too exhausted to make it to her bedroom. She thought about the Christmas mornings when she had wrapped presents in newspaper because she couldn't afford gift wrap, about the time she had told Emma they were having adventure meals when all they had left was cereal and peanut butter. Every sacrifice had been for Emma's future, for the moment when her sister would walk across that graduation stage and become Dr. Emma Chen. Sarah had earned this seat through years of backbreaking work and careful saving. She deserved to be here not because of her bank account but because of her dedication and love. But looking at the faces around her, Sarah realized that none of that mattered to these people. They saw her clothes, her book, her discomfort in their world, and they had made their judgment. No explanation would change their minds. No amount of dignity would earn their respect. Jessica was speaking again, her voice more urgent now. "Ma'am, I really need you to cooperate here. If you don't move voluntarily, I'll have to call security to remove you." Security, the threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sarah imagined being dragged from the plane in handcuffs, missing Emma's graduation, becoming a viral video of another person being mistreated by an airline. The humiliation would be complete. She looked out the window at the clouds below, thinking about how high up they were, how far she had fallen in just a few minutes. This morning she had been excited, proud, ready to celebrate her sister's achievement. Now she was being treated like a criminal for the crime of existing in a space where she wasn't wanted. The other passengers were getting restless. Someone was complaining loudly about the delay. Another person was demanding to speak to the captain. The atmosphere in the cabin had turned toxic, and Sarah was at the center of it all. She closed her eyes and made the decision that would haunt her for days to come. Rather than fight a battle she couldn't win, rather than risk missing Emma's graduation entirely, she would give in to their demands. She would move to economy and try to salvage what was left of her dignity. "Fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll move." The relief in Jessica's face was immediate and obvious. "Thank you for being understanding, ma'am. I'll make sure you're comfortable in your new seat." Sarah began gathering her few belongings with hands that shook with shame and anger. Her paperback book felt heavy in her hands, a symbol of everything these people found lacking about her. Her small purse, which contained her life savings carefully budgeted for Emma's graduation weekend, seemed shabby and pathetic now. As she prepared to walk the length of the plane under the judgmental stares of first-class passengers, Sarah felt something inside her break. It wasn't just her pride or her confidence, it was her faith in the idea that hard work and good intentions could overcome prejudice and cruelty. Victoria watched her pack with obvious satisfaction, already settling back into her seat as if Sarah had never existed. The businessman had returned to his tablet, the crisis resolved to his satisfaction. The woman who had been recording put away her phone, disappointed perhaps that the confrontation hadn't escalated further. None of them saw Sarah as a person with feelings, with dreams, with a story worth knowing. To them she was just an obstacle that had been successfully removed, a problem that had been solved. They would probably forget about her before the plane landed. But Sarah would never forget this moment, this feeling of being stripped of her dignity in front of strangers, of being judged and found wanting based on nothing more than appearances and assumptions. As she prepared to take the walk of shame to the back of the plane, she had no idea that someone had been watching the entire confrontation with growing anger and disbelief. Sarah was halfway down the aisle when a deep voice from the cockpit doorway stopped everyone in their tracks. "What exactly is happening here?" The voice carried an authority that made even Victoria Ashford pause mid-celebration. Captain Michael Rodriguez stepped into the first-class cabin, his pilot's uniform immaculate, his expression stern as his dark eyes swept across the scene. Jessica immediately straightened, her professional composure wavering under the captain's intense gaze. "Captain Rodriguez, we're just relocating a passenger to ensure everyone's comfort." Michael's eyes found Sarah still clutching her belongings in the middle of the aisle, her face flushed with humiliation. Something in her posture, the way she held herself despite being broken down, made his jaw clench. Relocating based on what policy exactly? "Well, sir, there was an incident with spilled water and some passengers felt uncomfortable," Jessica stammered, suddenly realizing how flimsy her justification sounded when questioned by the captain. Michael walked slowly through the cabin, his presence commanding immediate attention from every passenger. When he reached Victoria, his voice was calm but carried an edge that made her shrink back slightly. "Mrs. Ashford, isn't it? I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about passenger standards." Victoria straightened, apparently assuming the captain was there to support her position. "Yes, Captain, I was simply pointing out that certain individuals don't seem to understand the expectations of first-class service." "Interesting perspective," Michael replied, his tone deceptively mild. "Tell me, what exactly makes someone qualified to sit in first class? Their bank account? Their clothing? Their choice of reading material?" "Well, obviously there are certain standards of behavior and presentation that should be maintained," Victoria replied, though she seemed less confident now. Michael turned to Sarah, who stood frozen in the aisle like a deer caught in headlights. "Ma'am, did you purchase your ticket legitimately?" "Yes, sir," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Have you violated any actual airline policies or federal regulations?" "No, sir." "Have you been disruptive, intoxicated, or threatening to other passengers?" "No, sir." Michael nodded slowly, then turned back to face the first-class cabin. His voice when he spoke carried the weight of absolute authority. "Then she stays exactly where she paid to be." Victoria's face turned purple with indignation. "Captain, I demand that you consider the comfort of your other passengers. This woman clearly doesn't belong here, and her presence is ruining the flight experience for everyone else." "The only thing ruining anyone's flight experience is the display of cruelty and prejudice I just witnessed," Michael replied sharply. "This woman has done nothing wrong except fail to meet your arbitrary standards of appearance." The businessman who had been supporting Victoria suddenly found his voice. "Captain, surely you understand that first-class passengers expect a certain atmosphere. We pay premium prices for premium service. You pay for a seat, sir, not for the right to humiliate other human beings." Michael's voice was ice-cold now. "And if anyone here is uncomfortable with treating all passengers with basic respect, you're welcome to request a different flight." Sarah stood there in shock, unable to believe that someone was actually defending her. After years of being invisible, of accepting poor treatment because she needed her job or couldn't afford to make waves, here was a complete stranger standing up for her dignity. Michael turned to Jessica with an expression that made the flight attendant pale. "Miss Patterson, please escort this passenger back to her assigned seat and ensure she receives the same level of service as every other first-class passenger." "But Captain," Jessica protested weakly, the other passengers will behave like civilized adults, or they'll find themselves having a very uncomfortable conversation with airport security when we land." Michael interrupted. "Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Collins, and anyone else who has a problem with this arrangement is welcome to discuss alternative seating in economy." The threat hung in the air like electricity. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no words came out. The businessman suddenly became very interested in his tablet screen. The woman who had been recording earlier quickly put her phone away. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Thank you, she whispered to Michael as Jessica reluctantly guided her back to seat 2A. Don't thank me yet, Michael replied quietly, but his eyes were kind. Just enjoy your flight. As Sarah settled back into her seat, the atmosphere in the cabin had completely shifted. Victoria sat in stony silence, her earlier triumph turned to bitter defeat. The other passengers who had supported her seemed suddenly fascinated by their personal devices or the view outside their windows. Jessica, clearly rattled by the captain's intervention, appeared at Sarah's seat with a complimentary glass of champagne and the premium meal service she had earlier declined. I apologize for any inconvenience, ma'am, she said through gritted teeth. Sarah accepted the offerings graciously, though food was the last thing on her mind. She kept stealing glances toward the cockpit, wondering about the man who had so forcefully defended her. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that felt personal rather than just professional duty. The rest of the flight passed in relative peace. Victoria maintained her hostile silence, occasionally shooting venomous looks in Sarah's direction, but no longer daring to voice her complaints. The other passengers seemed to have collectively decided that ignoring Sarah completely was their best strategy. As they began their descent into Seattle, Michael's voice came over the intercom with routine landing announcements. Sarah found herself listening intently to the sound of his voice, remembering how it had cut through the chaos to defend her when no one else would. When the plane finally touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, Sarah noticed Michael emerge from the cockpit to thank passengers for flying with them, as many captains did. He worked his way through first class, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, but when he reached Sarah's row he paused. I hope the rest of your flight was more pleasant, he said quietly. It was, thanks to you, Sarah replied, standing to face him properly. I don't know why you did that, but it meant everything to me. Michael studied her face for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they do for a living or what they can afford to wear. There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah think he understood her situation more deeply than a simple professional courtesy would explain. Are you always this protective of your passengers? She asked. A small smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him. Only the ones who remind me of what really matters in life. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Victoria Ashford pushed past them both with an exaggerated huff, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear. I'll certainly be filing a complaint about this flight. Michael's expression hardened again. You do that, Mrs. Ashford. I'll be sure to include a full report of the incident in my flight log. As Victoria stalked away, dragging her expensive luggage behind her, Michael turned back to Sarah. I hope your time in Seattle is everything you're hoping for. My sister is graduating from medical school tomorrow, Sarah found herself saying, though she wasn't sure why she was sharing personal information with a stranger. Congratulations to her, and to you for whatever sacrifices you made to help her get there. Again that knowing look, as if he could see right through to her story. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. How did you, lucky guess, Michael replied, but his smile suggested it was more than that. Enjoy the graduation. She's lucky to have someone who believes in her enough to fight for her dreams. As passengers continued filing off the plane, Sarah gathered her belongings slowly, reluctant to end this unexpected encounter. When she finally reached the jet bridge, she turned back to see Michael still standing in the doorway watching her go. 3 months later, Sarah was working her usual evening shift at Denver General Hospital when she heard a familiar voice asking for directions at the nurse's station. She looked up from her patient charts to see Michael Rodriguez, dressed in civilian clothes, looking slightly nervous as he spoke to the head nurse. Excuse me, he was saying, I'm looking for Sarah Chen. I believe she works here. Sarah's heart stopped. She hadn't been able to get him out of her mind since that flight, but she had convinced herself that their brief encounter had meant nothing to him. What was he doing here? She approached slowly, hardly believing her eyes. Captain Rodriguez. He turned at the sound of her voice, and his face broke into that same warm smile she remembered. Please call me Michael, and I was hoping you'd say that. What are you doing here? Sarah asked, still in shock. Well, Michael said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that made him seem less like the commanding pilot she remembered, and more like a nervous man asking someone out. I was wondering if you'd like to grab dinner sometime. I know it's been months, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about that flight. Sarah stared at him, aware that her colleagues were watching with obvious curiosity. You came to my workplace to ask me out. I realized I never got your last name or your contact information, Michael admitted. And I couldn't stop thinking about what you said about your sister's graduation, about everything you've done for her. I wanted to hear more of your story. Why? Sarah asked, genuinely puzzled. Michael was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because, in a world full of people who think they're entitled to everything, you're someone who fights for what matters. Because you didn't back down even when everyone was against you. Because you remind me that there are still good people worth knowing. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes again, but these were happy tears. Emma passed her boards, she said suddenly. She's officially a doctor now. I'd love to hear about it, Michael replied. Over dinner if you're interested. Looking at him standing there in the hospital hallway, still the same man who had defended her when she needed it most, Sarah realized that sometimes the worst moments in life really do lead to the best ones. Sometimes standing up for yourself, even when it seems hopeless, opens doors you never knew existed. I'd like that very much, she said. 6 months later at their wedding reception, Michael would tell their guests that he fell in love with Sarah the moment he saw her refuse to be treated as less than she was worth. Sarah would tell them that she fell in love with a man who saw her value when everyone else saw only her circumstances. But that evening in the hospital, as they made plans for their first real date, all that mattered was that two people had found each other at exactly the right moment, when they both needed to remember that kindness and dignity still existed in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.